Well, hello. I'd love to share a short reflection with you today. And I want to start by asking you a question. Are you a rule follower or a rule breaker? One of my children is through and through a rule breaker. Not necessarily in a malicious sense, but if a line was drawn in the sand and I say, don't go over there, she'll definitely want to just touch the other side or just put her tiny toe over the line and to test and see what happens. And I know that I can definitely be like that too. We've had a fair few rules to follow, haven't we, over this past year? Sometimes that's been really tricky to interpret and understand and get our heads around. The rule of 6, and can I walk with, how many people can I go for a walk with? Can I sit on this park bench? Can I take a cup of coffee with me or have a picnic somewhere? How far can I travel? There's been a lot of things to get our heads around. But one thing that I need to remember, and perhaps we all do, need to teach our children to remember, is that rules are good things. And they're not just there for us to be broken, but there to protect us and to ensure that we can all live well together. Certainly over this past year, it has been about keeping us all safe, caring for one another. So rules are a really good thing. And today we're looking at Deuteronomy, which is basically, if you like, where Moses is charged to give the Israelites, to give God's people a bit of a pep talk about obedience. It's not always easy to be obedient, is it? But here in this part of God's words, the people have been rescued from slavery in the Exodus. They've been given the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai, but for about 40 years they've been wandering in the wilderness, being pretty rebellious, and really, despite God's kindness and provision to them, they haven't yet entered the promised land. And Moses here is explaining to the next generation about God and encouraging them to be faithful to him, to follow his ways, to follow his laws. And let's see what we can glean from this today for ourselves. I want to ask the question, why should we live in obedience to God's laws? Because there are a couple of reasons that I want us just to note, and then we can think about what that means for us today. So why should we live in obedience to God's laws? Deuteronomy 4, verse 1, has a reason. Now Israel, hear the decrees and laws I'm about to teach you. Follow them so that you may live and may go in and take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. Well, the first reasons why we should live in obedience here is because it says, verse 1, that you may live. There was definitely a link at the time that obedience equals blessing. Obedience to God's law means that you might live well together and that God might bless you. And we're not going to read it, but just in the next couple of verses, we can see that it speaks of destruction when people turned away from God. And so there's a definite correlation here that obeying God's law means that you'll live and that things will go well for you. Secondly, why should we live in obedience to God's law? I'm going to read verses 6 and 7. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about all these decrees and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them, the way the Lord our God is near us whenever we pray to him? Well, here we can see that living in obedience to God's laws is a great witness to those around. We can hear and see in verse 6 that it talks about God gives wisdom and understanding through his law, that people would see that. And also, wonderfully, that they might see a personal relationship, that it says that God is near them and close when they obey him. So the Israelites here are being encouraged to model life, what it looks like to live under God's law, to be obedient to him, so that the nations around might also see that and follow God. Well, what about for us today? What does it look like for us to be obedient to God's law? And Jesus quotes, doesn't he, in the New Testament, the law, the one main law that we are to follow with all our heart. And it's this, isn't it? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And I wonder today, as we reflect together, what it would look like to do that well. For our relationship with God, those closest to us, our friends and our neighbours, what would it look like to love well in that context? Because I think as we love God with all our being, as we obey that law, that he will transform us from the inside out. And that will be a great witness to those around us.